The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a dust-covered courier who seemed eager to leave the moment he'd handed it over. Eloise May Sullivan stood in the doorway of her family's weathered farmhouse, watching the rider disappear into the Kansas horizon before looking down at the envelope in her hands. The paper felt heavy, weighted with more than just ink and promises. "Well, don't just stand there gawking," her stepmother Martha called from inside. "That's your future you're holding." Eloise's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The marriage broker's handwriting was neat and businesslike, each word carefully chosen to paint a picture that was both honest and deliberately vague. Her intended was described as a man of property in the Arizona Territory, seeking a capable woman for matrimony and household management. What the letter didn't say immediately was more telling than what it did. It wasn't until the second paragraph that the truth emerged like a rattlesnake from tall grass. "Mr. Red Hawk is of Apache descent, though fully civilized and Christian in his habits." The words swam before her eyes. Apache, even here in Kansas. Stories traveled about the fierce warriors of the Southwest, about raids and scalping and unspeakable cruelties. But what choice did she have? At 23, with her reputation in tatters after Thomas Hartley had spread those vicious lies about finding her in the barn with a hired hand, lies that everyone chose to believe despite her protests, she was damaged goods in the marriage market. "Apache," Martha said, reading over her shoulder with barely concealed satisfaction. "Well, beggars can't be choosers, can they? At least you'll be off our hands." Her father, Samuel, sat silent in his chair by the fireplace, his face carved with lines of guilt and resignation. He'd tried to defend her honor when the rumors started, but his voice had been drowned out by the tide of gossip. Now he couldn't even meet her eyes. "When do I leave?" Eloise asked, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "Train departs Thursday next," Martha replied. "Gives us time to pack what little you'll be taking." The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Eloise folded her few decent dresses, wrapped her mother's Bible in brown paper, and tried not to think about what awaited her. The other women in town looked at her with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction when word spread about her mail-order arrangement. Whispers followed her through the general store. "Marrying a savage. Lord knows what he'll do to her. Probably better than she deserves." The train station in Topeka was crowded with travelers, but Eloise felt utterly alone as she stood on the platform with her single trunk. Her father had driven her in silence, finally pressing a small leather pouch into her hand as she prepared to board. "Your mother's ring," he said hoarsely. "She would have wanted you to have it." "Papa, I'm sorry. Ellie, for everything. I should have done more." But the train whistle cut off any reply, and soon she was settled in a hard wooden seat, watching the familiar planes roll by through a grimy window. The journey would take her through Colorado and down into New Mexico territory before finally reaching Arizona. 3 days of travel toward an unknown fate. As night fell and the other passengers dozed, Eloise pulled out the letter again. There was a photograph tucked behind it that she'd been too frightened to examine closely before. Now, by the dim light of the swaying oil lamp, she studied the image. It showed a modest wooden structure set against a backdrop of red rocks and endless sky. Her future home. There was no photograph of the man himself. The train stopped frequently at small stations along the route. At each stop, the landscape grew more foreign, more forbidding. The lush greens of Kansas gave way to the browns and reds of the desert. Mountains rose like ancient sentinels in the distance. The air grew dry and thin, making her cough. In Albuquerque, she had to change trains for the final leg of the journey. The station was rough, filled with cowboys, miners, and Mexicans speaking rapid Spanish. She clutched her carpetbag close and tried to remain invisible. But a woman traveling alone always drew attention. "You the mail-order bride headed to Fort Apache?" A grizzled man in a battered hat leered at her. "Heard tell there's some fool woman gonna marry one of them redskins." Eloise kept her eyes down and moved away. But others had heard. The whispers followed her onto the smaller, rougher train that would take her into Arizona territory. Her fellow passengers were mostly men, soldiers, prospectors, and merchants. They eyed her with open curiosity and worse. The final stop before her destination was the town of Holbrook, a rough collection of saloons, trading posts, and dubious hotels. She had to spend the night there before taking the stage to the smaller settlement near Fort Apache, where she would meet her intended, the hotel clerk. Upon hearing her name, gave her a look that made her skin crawl. "Room 7, he said, sliding a key across the scarred wooden counter. "Though if you've come to your senses about marrying that Apache, there's plenty of civilized men here who'd take you instead." She snatched the key without responding and hurried upstairs. The room was small and stifling, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Through the thin walls, she could hear the revelry from the saloon below. She wedged a chair under the doorknob and tried to sleep. Near midnight, the doorknob rattled. "Hey, pretty bride," a slurred voice called. "Come have a drink with us." "No need to save yourself for that savage." More laughter, more voices. The door shook as someone pushed against it. Eloise sat up in bed, her heart pounding, clutching the small derringer her father had secretly packed in her trunk. The chair held, and eventually the men stumbled away, but she didn't sleep again that night. Dawn came as a relief. She dressed carefully in her traveling suit, pinned her hair severely back, and prepared to face whatever came next. The stage left at 7, and she was the only passenger. The driver, a leathery man named Jake, at least seemed professional rather than threatening. "It's a hard road where you're going, miss," he said as he helped her with her trunk. "That Apache of yours, he lives pretty far from town, keeps to himself mostly. Folks say he's peaceable enough, but..." "But what?" Eloise asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Just that there's reasons a man like that needs to send for a bride from back east. Apache women won't have him, and neither will the Mexicans or whites hereabouts." The stage rolled through increasingly desolate country. Red rocks towered above them, carved by wind and time into fantastic shapes. The heat was oppressive even though it was barely spring. Dust coated everything, working its way into her clothes, her hair, her throat. They stopped once to change horses at a way station. The Mexican family running it stared at her with knowing looks. The woman crossed herself and muttered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. As afternoon wore on, Jake pointed to a cluster of buildings in the distance. "That's Cedar Ridge. Your Apache will meet you there." The town was smaller than Holbrook, just a main street with a few businesses, a church, and scattered houses. But Eloise barely noticed the buildings. Her attention was fixed on the man standing beside a weathered wagon at the far end of the street. He was tall, dressed in a mix of white man's clothing and Apache elements. Denim pants, a cotton shirt, but with a colorful woven belt and silver ornaments in his long black hair. Even from a distance, she could see the wariness in his stance, the way he held himself apart from the townspeople who were pretending not to stare. The stage rolled to a stop. Jake helped her down, and she stood in the dusty street, aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. Her intended approached slowly, and she got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Scars marked his hands and what she could see of his arms. His expression was carefully neutral, but she caught something in his eyes. Was it disappointment? Relief? She couldn't tell. "Miss Sullivan," he said. His voice was deep, his English careful and precise. "I'm Red Hawk. Thank you for coming." She attempted a curtsy, feeling foolish in the dust. "Mr. Red Hawk. Just Red Hawk," he corrected gently. He moved to take her trunk from Jake, handling it easily despite its weight. "We should go. It's a long ride." She noticed how the townspeople drew back as he passed, mothers pulling their children closer. The hostility was palpable. At the general store, where he'd apparently left some supplies, the proprietor threw the packages at his feet rather than hand them over. Red Hawk picked them up without comment. his face expressionless. Treating a white woman like livestock, someone muttered loud enough to be heard. Ought to be a law. Eloise felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Red Hawk simply continued loading the wagon. When everything was secured, he helped her onto the bench seat, his touch brief and impersonal. She noticed his hands were calloused but clean, his movements careful as if he was aware of his own strength. As they rolled out of town, leaving the stares and whispers behind, Eloise stole glances at the man beside her. He drove with quiet competence, his eyes scanning the horizon. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the creak of wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk. Finally, she found her voice. "How far is it to our home?" "Half a day's ride," he replied. "We'll camp tonight and arrive tomorrow." Camp, alone with him in the wilderness. Her hands clenched in her lap, but she kept her voice steady. "I see." He must have caught something in her tone because he glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "You have nothing to fear from me, Miss Sullivan. I give you my word." And oddly, looking into those dark, serious eyes, she found herself believing him. Whatever else this man might be, she sensed he was not casually cruel. It was a small comfort as they rode into the vast, unknowable desert, toward a life she could barely imagine. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, painting the rocks in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Eloise May Sullivan, who had never been further from home than Topeka, rolled toward her new life with a stranger who moved through the world like a ghost, unwelcome in both the white man's world and perhaps his own. The wagon rolled steadily through a landscape that seemed torn from another world. Eloise had never imagined such colors could exist in nature. Red rocks that blazed like fire in the afternoon sun, purple shadows pooling in deep canyons, and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The trail, if it could be called that, wound between massive stone formations that rose like ancient cathedrals from the desert floor. Red Hawk handled the horses with quiet expertise, guiding them around obstacles she hadn't even noticed. Occasionally, he would point out something, a golden eagle circling high above, a cluster of beryl cacti blooming with vivid pink flowers, ancient symbols carved into a cliff face by people long gone. His voice remained soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't used to having someone to talk to. The heat was oppressive. Unlike anything she'd experienced in Kansas, it seemed to rise from the earth itself, shimmering in waves that made distant objects dance and waver. She'd worn her traveling suit thinking to make a good impression, but now the heavy fabric clung to her skin, and she could feel perspiration gathering along her spine. Without comment, Red Hawk reached behind the seat and produced a canteen wrapped in damp cloth. "Small sips," he advised. "The desert takes more water from you than you realize." The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals. She tried to drink delicately, aware of his eyes on her, but thirst won over propriety. When she handed it back, she thought she caught the ghost of a smile on his face. "We'll stop soon," he said. "The horses need rest, and the worst heat will pass in a few hours." They pulled into the shade of an enormous red rock formation. The temperature dropped immediately, and Eloise nearly sighed with relief. Red Hawk unhitched the horses with practiced movements, leading them to a small seep where water trickled from the stone. While they drank, he unpacked supplies from the wagon. "There's a blanket if you'd like to rest," he offered, gesturing to a smooth area of sand beneath an overhang. "I'll prepare food." She wanted to protest, to show she could be useful, but exhaustion weighed her down. The blanket he spread was woven in intricate patterns of red, black, and white. She sat carefully, watching as he built a small fire despite the heat, explaining when he caught her puzzled look. "For coffee, and to keep the snakes away." Snakes. Of course there would be snakes. He prepared a simple meal of dried meat, hard biscuit, and, surprisingly, fresh apples. From the Mormon settlements, he explained when she commented on the fruit. They trade fairly, unlike most. As they ate in companionable silence, Eloise studied him more openly. In the diffused light of their shelter, she could see that what she'd taken for simple decoration in his hair were actually small silver ornaments of intricate workmanship. His shirt, though styled like any ranch hand's, was made of finer cloth than she'd expected. Everything about him spoke of a man caught between two worlds. "May I ask," she ventured, emboldened by his gentle manner, "how you came to live out here alone?" His hand stilled in the act of rewrapping the remaining food. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "My mother's people once moved freely through these lands. My father was a trader from Missouri who stayed when others left. I was raised in both worlds, welcome in neither." He paused, looking out at the stark landscape. "This place, it asks nothing of me but survival." That seemed enough. Until I realized survival alone is just another form of death. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eloise found herself thinking of her own life in Kansas, going through the motions day after day, her spirit slowly withering under the weight of shame and gossip. Perhaps they had more in common than she'd thought. They traveled on as the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The trail climbed steadily upward, winding through stands of juniper and pinyon pine. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of resin and sage. Once, they surprised a small herd of deer that bounded away with white tails flashing. As darkness approached, Red Hawk turned the wagon off the trail into a protected grove of cottonwoods. A spring bubbled up from the rocks, feeding a small pool before disappearing back into the earth. The sound of water was like music after the day's dry silence. "We camp here tonight," he announced, already moving to tend the horses. Eloise climbed down from the wagon, her muscles stiff from the long ride. The grove felt like a secret sanctuary, cut off from the harsh world outside. Fireflies began to blink in the gathering dusk, and somewhere a poor will called mournfully. She helped where she could, gathering kindling for the fire, refilling the canteens at the spring. Red Hawk watched her efforts with something like approval, though he stepped in when she reached for a piece of wood that harbored a scorpion. "Always check first," he said quietly, using a stick to flip the creature away. "The desert has many ways to bite." He prepared a better meal that evening. Fresh bread he'd kept wrapped in damp cloth, beans seasoned with wild herbs, even a pot of tea brewed from some plant she didn't recognize but which tasted pleasantly of mint and flowers. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames creating a barrier of light between them. "Your letter," Eloise began hesitantly, "said very little about what you expect from this arrangement." He was quiet for so long she wondered if she'd offended him. When he finally spoke, his eyes remained on the fire. "I expect nothing you're not willing to give. I need someone to share the work of living, the loneliness." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I thought I was strong enough to bear it. I was wrong." His gaze lifted to meet hers. "I will provide for you, protect you. In return, I hope for companionship. Perhaps, in time, something more, but that's for you to decide." The honesty in his words, the lack of assumption or demand, eased something in her chest. "That seems fair." He showed her where to lay her bedroll, close enough to the fire for warmth and protection, but with respectful distance between them. As she prepared for sleep, she realized he intended to bed down under the open sky despite the chill. "Aren't you cold?" she asked. "I'm used to it, and you'll rest better knowing I'm keeping watch." She wanted to protest that it wasn't necessary, but the truth was, she did feel safer knowing he was there. As she lay looking up at stars more numerous than she'd ever imagined, listening to the fire pop and the spring bubble, she found herself reassessing everything she'd thought she knew about this man. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Frost sparkled on the grass, and their breath misted in the air. Red Hawk was already up, the fire rekindled and coffee brewing. He'd also laid out a basin of warm water for washing, along with a clean cloth. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, grateful for the small luxury. "A while. I wanted to show you something." After a quick breakfast, he led her to the eastern edge of their grove. The land fell away dramatically, revealing a vista that stole her breath. Miles of painted desert stretched to the horizon, layer upon layer of colored stone telling the story of ages. The morning sun turned it all to gold and shadow, a landscape both beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. "Your new home," he said simply. They reached his cabin in the late afternoon. It sat in a sheltered valley watered by a permanent stream, surrounded by cottonwoods and willows. The structure itself was better than she'd expected, solidly built of logs and adobe, with real glass windows and a covered porch. A small corral held several horses, and she could see a garden plot, now dormant for winter. But it was the touches of unexpected beauty that caught her attention. Wind chimes made of silver and turquoise hanging from the porch. A climbing rose trained over an arbor. Designs painted on the door in faded but still visible symbols. Inside was equally surprising. Clean, orderly, with handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship. Books lined one wall, more than she'd expected to find in such a remote place. A painting of a desert sunset hung above the fireplace, and woven blankets added splashes of color. "My mother's work," he said, noticing her admiration of a particularly fine weaving. "She tried to teach me, but my hands were better suited to other things." He showed her to what would be her room, small but private, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and another of those beautiful blankets. Her trunk was already there, carried in while she'd been examining the main room. "Take your time settling in," he said. "I'll see to the animals." Alone for the first time since leaving Kansas, Eloise sat on the bed and tried to absorb it all. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd prepared herself for squalor, for roughness, for a man who would see her as nothing more than unpaid labor and breeding stock. Instead, she'd found this: a clean, comfortable home, and a man who spoke softly and slept in the cold so she wouldn't be afraid. Through the window, she could see him working with the horses, his movements gentle and sure. One of them, a spotted mare, nuzzled his shoulder affectionately. He produced something from his pocket, an apple, she realized, and fed it to her, stroking her neck as she ate. That evening, as she unpacked her few belongings, she found herself humming. When was the last time she'd done that? When she emerged to help with supper? Red Hawk looked up with surprise. "You sing." "Not well," she admitted, flushing. "My mother tried to teach me, but I never had the voice for it." "Any music is welcome here," he said. "It's been too quiet for too long." They prepared the meal together, falling into an easy rhythm. She noticed how he moved, always aware of where she was, always careful not to crowd or startle her. It was consideration born of long practice. She realized this was a man who had learned to make himself unthreatening in a world that saw him as a threat. After supper, as they sat by the fire, she asked about the books. "Traders, mostly," he explained. "Sometimes soldiers at the fort who need guides. I trade for what I can. Books, supplies, news of the world." He paused. "Can you read?" "Yes, my mother insisted." She moved to examine the titles. Shakespeare, some novels, books on agriculture and animal husbandry, even a few volumes of poetry. "These are well cared for. They've been my only companions. Books don't judge. They don't cross the street when they see you coming." The bitterness in his voice was mild but unmistakable. She thought of the town they'd passed through, the hostile faces, the way people had acted as if his very presence was a contamination. "Is it always like that? In town?" "Usually. Sometimes worse." He shrugged as if it didn't matter. But she caught the tension in his shoulders. "The fort commander keeps the peace. Mostly. He knows I scout for them sometimes. Find water, track raiders, Apache and white both. It buys me tolerance, if not acceptance." Later, as she prepared for her first night in her new home, she found extra blankets stacked outside her door. The house had grown cold as the fire died down, and she was grateful for the warmth. from the main room. She could hear him banking the coals, the soft scrape of metal on stone. "Good night, Miss Sullivan," he called softly. "Eloise," she corrected. "If we're to live together, you should use my given name." There was a pause. "Good night, Eloise." "Good night, Red Hawk." She lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home. Wind in the cottonwoods, the distant yip of coyotes, the creek murmuring over stones, somewhere in the house. A board creaked as Red Hawk moved about. She realized he was making a bed on the floor of the main room, giving her not just privacy but also placing himself between her and any danger that might come to the door. The gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes. When she'd left Kansas, she'd thought she was trading one form of misery for another, possibly worse. Instead, she'd found this, a chance at something she'd never dared hope for. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but respect, kindness, the possibility of building a life with someone who understood what it meant to be an outsider. Tomorrow would bring challenges. She had much to learn about surviving in this harsh land. There would be work, cooking, cleaning, mending, helping with the endless tasks of frontier living. And somewhere beyond this peaceful valley, the prejudice and hatred of the outside world waited. But tonight, warm beneath hand-woven blankets in a clean, quiet room, with a good man keeping watch, Eloise May Sullivan allowed herself something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The first weeks passed in a blur of adjustment. Each morning, Eloise woke to the sound of Red Hawk moving quietly about, stoking the fire and preparing coffee before heading out to tend the animals. She quickly learned to rise with him, unwilling to be seen as a burden or a delicate eastern flower unable to handle frontier life. The work was harder than anything she'd known in Kansas. Water had to be hauled from the creek for washing and cooking. The cast-iron stove required constant feeding and careful management to maintain proper heat. Clothes were scrubbed on a washboard with lye soap that left her hands raw until they developed calluses. But Red Hawk never let her struggle alone. He showed her how to bank the fire to last through the night, how to judge the stove's temperature by dropping water on its surface, how to make the harsh soap gentler with added fat and wood ash. His teachings were patient, practical, delivered in that soft voice that never rose even when she made mistakes. "Here," he said one morning, finding her wrestling with wet laundry in a stiff wind. "Face them this way. Let the wind work for you, not against you." He demonstrated, his brown hands deft with the clothespins, and she found herself staring at the contrast of his masculine strength handling such a domestic task. When he caught her looking, she flushed and turned away, but not before seeing what might have been amusement in his eyes. She learned to cook with ingredients foreign to her: venison instead of beef, wild herbs instead of garden vegetables, cornmeal and beans as staples when flour ran low. Red Hawk hunted with bow and rifle both, always sharing his knowledge. "Tracks tell stories," he explained one afternoon, kneeling beside the creek. "This deer came to drink at dawn. See how the prints are sharp, not yet softened by heat. And here," he pointed to a disturbance in the mud. "A coyote waited in the brush, but the deer scented him and bounded away." "How can you know all that from marks in the mud?" He glanced up at her, and this time there was definitely a smile tugging at his lips. "My grandfather could track a hawk's shadow across stone. I'm still learning." Evenings became her favorite time. After supper was cleared and the dishes washed, a task they'd fallen into doing together without discussion, they would sit by the fire. Sometimes Red Hawk would work on leather, his hands moving in intricate patterns as he tooled designs into belts and bags. Eloise would mend clothes or read aloud from one of the books, her voice filling the quiet cabin with stories of distant places and times. "You read well?" he commented one night after she'd finished a chapter of Ivanhoe. "Like you can see it all happening." "My mother loved stories. She said they were windows to other worlds." She hesitated, then added, "I could teach you, if you'd like, to read better. I noticed you struggle sometimes with the longer words." His hands stilled on the leather. "Mission school taught me letters, but not love for them. That came later, when the words were all I had. He looked at her across the fire. I would be grateful to learn. So their evenings expanded to include lessons. He was a quick student, hungry for knowledge, and she discovered he could already read more than he'd let on. It was the subtleties of English that tripped him, the strange spellings, the words that meant different things in different contexts. English is a thief language, he said once in frustration. It takes from everyone and follows no one's rules. That's actually quite accurate, she laughed, and was rewarded with one of his rare, full smiles that transformed his usually solemn face. 3 weeks into her new life, Red Hawk announced they needed supplies from town. Eloise felt her stomach tighten at the thought of facing those hostile faces again, but knew it was inevitable. You could stay here, he offered, reading her apprehension. I can manage alone. No, she lifted her chin. If this is my home now, I need to face what comes with it. Something flickered in his eyes. Respect? Pride? It was gone before she could identify it. The trip to Cedar Ridge was as unpleasant as she'd feared. Women pulled their skirts aside as she passed, as if her association with Red Hawk was contagious. Men made crude comments just loud enough to be heard. In the general store, Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor's wife, made a show of counting the change 3 times, just to be sure. Red Hawk bore it all with stoic calm, but Eloise could see the tension in his jaw, the careful way he kept his hands visible and moved slowly, non-threateningly. It was a practiced diminishment, she realized, a survival tactic learned through years of such treatment. On the way home, she finally spoke. How do you stand it? By remembering that their hatred says more about them than about me. He guided the horses around a rough patch in the trail, and by having somewhere else to be. That night, he gave her a gift, a small leather pouch decorated with beadwork. Inside was a mixture of herbs. For your hands, he explained. Make a paste with water and apply before bed. They'll heal faster. She was touched by the gesture, this evidence that he'd noticed her struggles and quietly found a solution. Thank you. He nodded and retreated to his evening tasks. But she caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, something unreadable in his dark eyes. The day everything shifted started like any other. Eloise was gathering eggs from the small flock of chickens Red Hawk kept when she slipped on loose stones near the creek bank. She went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her, pain shooting up her leg like fire. Her cry brought Red Hawk running from the corral. He was beside her in moments, his hands gentle as they examined her ankle. Not broken, he said with relief, but badly twisted. Can you stand? She tried, gasping as weight hit the injured joint. Without hesitation, he swept her up in his arms, carrying her as easily as if she weighed nothing. This close, she could smell sage and leather, feel the steady beat of his heart through his shirt. He set her carefully on the bed in her room, then knelt to remove her boot. His fingers were impossibly gentle as they probed the swelling flesh. I need to wrap this, he said. It will hurt. She nodded, biting her lip as he worked. Despite the pain, she found herself focused on his bent head, the way his hair fell forward like a black curtain, the absolute concentration on his face. When he finished, he sat back on his heels. You'll need to stay off it for a few days. But the chores we'll keep. His voice was firm. Healing comes first. For 3 days, he tended her with a gentleness that made her heart ache. He brought meals, helped her to the necessary, even carried her to the porch so she could sit in the sun. And through it all, he maintained that careful distance, never touching more than required, never presuming. On the 4th morning, she tested the ankle and found she could walk with only a slight limp. She made her way to the kitchen, determined to resume her duties, and found him already preparing breakfast. You should rest longer, he said without turning. I'm well enough. She moved to help, and they worked in companionable silence until her hand accidentally brushed his, reaching for the same cup. Both froze. The touch was electric, sending warmth racing up her arm. Their eyes met, and she saw her own shock reflected in his face. Then he was stepping back, That careful distance re-established. "I should check the horses," he said roughly, and was gone before she could respond. That night, as they sat by the fire, the tension was palpable. Eloise tried to focus on her mending, but her awareness of him was acute, every movement, every breath. When she pricked her finger for the third time, she set the work aside with a frustrated sigh. "I should thank you," she said into the silence, "for caring for me these past days." He looked up from his leather work. "No thanks needed. It's what anyone would do." "No," she said firmly. "It's what you did, and I'm grateful." Their eyes held for a long moment before he looked away. "You should rest. Tomorrow we start preparing for winter." But she wasn't ready to retreat. Something had shifted between them, and she needed to understand it. "Redhawk, can I ask you something?" He nodded warily. "That day in town, when we married, did you—" She struggled for words. "Were you disappointed? When you saw me?" His hands stilled. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I know why I was there. Unwanted. Cast off, with no choices left. But you chose this. Chose to send for a wife. You could have asked for someone prettier, younger, more—" "Stop!" The word was sharp, the first time he'd ever interrupted her. He set aside his work and looked at her directly. "You think I was disappointed? Eloise, when I saw you step off that stage, brave despite your fear, chin high despite what you'd endured, I thought the spirits were mocking me, sending me someone far better than I deserved." The words hung between them, raw and honest. She felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm not brave," she whispered. "No?" He leaned forward slightly. "You left everything you knew, traveled across hostile territory to marry a stranger, an Apache in a land that hates us. You face their contempt with dignity. You work until your hands bleed without complaint. If that's not courage, I don't know what is." A tear escaped, rolling down her cheek. Before she could wipe it away, he was there, kneeling beside her chair. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he reached up and caught the tear on his thumb. "Don't cry for them," he said softly. "They're not worth your tears." "I'm not," she managed. "I'm crying because you see me, really see me, and I thought no one would again." His hand was still raised, hovering near her face. She turned into it, pressing her cheek against his palm. He inhaled sharply, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with infinite care. "Eloise," he breathed, and her name on his lips was like a prayer. She covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. "All this time, I expected cruelty, harshness. Instead, you've shown me nothing but kindness. You handle me like something precious," he finished. "Because you are." The word broke something in her. She'd been called many things. Damaged, ruined, shameful. But precious? Never that. He must have seen the effect of his words, because suddenly he was pulling away, standing. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't, please." She caught his hand. "Don't apologize. Not for that." They stood frozen, her seated, him standing, hands clasped between them. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, wind sang through the cottonwoods, and somewhere a night bird called. "I should go," he said finally, but made no move to leave. "Should you?" The question hung in the air, loaded with possibilities. He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb moving over her knuckles. "What are you asking?" What was she asking? 3 weeks ago, she'd been a stranger expecting the worst. Now she was asking for something she'd never thought to want again. "I'm asking you to stay," she said simply. "Just stay." Slowly, as if afraid to spook her, he sat on the floor beside her chair, their hands still linked. They stayed that way for a long time, not speaking, just being. The space between them hummed with unspoken words, with want carefully controlled. When the fire burned low, he finally stirred. "You need rest. Tomorrow will come regardless." She interrupted. "But tonight, I'm not afraid." He raised their joined hands to his lips. pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent fire through her veins. "Neither am I." He left then, but the memory of his touch lingered. Eloise sat in the dying firelight, her hand pressed to her cheek where his had been, and marveled at how thoroughly her expectations had been overturned. She'd come here expecting survival. Instead, she'd found the possibility of something far more precious, a love born not of passion but of quiet understanding, gentle care, and the courage to reach across the void between two wounded souls. Outside, she heard him settling onto his bedroll on the porch, keeping watch as always. But now she understood he wasn't just guarding against external threats. He was guarding the fragile thing growing between them, giving it space to unfold at its own pace, in its own time. And for the first time since leaving Kansas, Eloise May Sullivan fell asleep with a smile on her face. The storm arrived without warning on a late October evening, rolling in from the mountains like a living thing. The temperature plummeted as black clouds swallowed the stars, and the first fat raindrops spattered against the windows with increasing violence. Within minutes, it had become a deluge. Eloise stood at the window, watching lightning illuminate the valley in stark, brief moments. Thunder followed close behind, rattling the glass panes. She'd weathered storms in Kansas, but this was different, wilder, more primal, as if the desert itself was releasing months of pent-up fury. "It'll likely last through the night," Red Hawk said from behind her. He'd spent the last hour securing everything outside, and his hair was already damp from the rain. "These autumn storms can be fierce," as if to emphasize his words. A particularly violent gust of wind shook the cabin. The fire in the hearth flickered, and somewhere outside, something crashed. Eloise pulled her shawl tighter, though the chill she felt had little to do with temperature. "Does the roof hold?" she asked, trying to keep the nervousness from her voice. "Always has." He moved to add more wood to the fire, though we might want to set out pots for the two spots that sometimes drip. They worked together, placing containers under the known weak points. As they did, the storm intensified. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 fists, and the wind found every gap in the walls, creating an eerie whistling that raised the hair on her arms. "I should bring in more wood before it soaked through," Red Hawk said, heading for the door. "In this?" Eloise caught his arm. "You can't go out there. We'll need it for the night. I'll be quick." But when he opened the door, the wind nearly tore it from his hands. Rain drove horizontally into the cabin, instantly soaking the floor. He managed to slam it shut, but not before both of them were drenched. "Perhaps the wood can wait," he conceded, water running from his hair down his face. Eloise couldn't help it. She laughed. The absurdity of the moment, the rare sight of him caught off guard, broke through her tension. After a moment, he smiled too, that genuine expression that transformed his features. "We need to change," she said, still giggling. "We'll catch our death standing here dripping." They retreated to their respective spaces. Eloise peeled off her sodden dress, shivering as she toweled dry and pulled on her warmest nightgown and wrapper. When she emerged, Red Hawk had changed into dry clothes and was kneeling by the fire, coaxing it back to full strength. Another crash of thunder shook the cabin, and the wind seemed to find new voice. The candles flickered despite being far from any draft, and the very air felt charged with electricity. Eloise found herself moving closer to the fire, and to Red Hawk. "Tell me about the worst storm you've weathered," she said, needing the comfort of conversation. He settled back on his heels, considering. "When I was 12, a blizzard caught us in the high country. My grandfather and I. 3 days we sheltered in a cave no bigger than this room, sharing warmth with our horses, living on dried meat and melted snow." "How did you stand it?" Grandfather told stories, the old ones, about how the world was made, why the coyote howls, where the stars came from. He could make hours pass like minutes with his words. His expression grew distant. He died the following spring. Sometimes I think he used the last of his strength keeping me calm during those 3 days. Eloise reached out instinctively, touching his shoulder. "I'm sorry," He covered her hand with his. It was long ago, but on nights like this, I remember his voice. The storm chose that moment to escalate. A tremendous crack split the air. So loud Eloise cried out. Lightning must have struck nearby. The flash had been blinding. In its aftermath, an ominous creaking came from above. Red Hawk was on his feet instantly. "The roof beam," he said, eyes scanning the ceiling. "That old cottonwood." His words were cut off by a grinding, tearing sound. Part of the roof lifted and peeled back like paper, and suddenly the storm was inside with them. Rain poured through the gap. Wind howled around the room, extinguishing candles and sending papers flying. "Your room!" Red Hawk shouted over the chaos. "Get what you can!" They rushed to salvage what they could from the exposed section. Eloise grabbed her few precious items, her mother's Bible, the journal she'd been keeping, the small bag of coins her father had given her. Red Hawk hauled her trunk to the driest corner, then began dragging furniture away from the worst of the rain, working together. They managed to contain the damage to one corner of the cabin. Red Hawk rigged a temporary covering using canvas and rope, though it did little more than redirect the water. By the time they finished, both were soaked again, exhausted and shivering. "The main room is still dry," he said, pushing wet hair from his eyes. "We'll have to make do there tonight." They changed again. Eloise was running out of dry clothes and reconvened by the fire. Red Hawk had dragged in the mattress from her bed before the rain reached it, positioning it near the hearth. He started to lay out his own bedroll on the opposite side of the room. "Don't be ridiculous," Eloise said. "We need to share warmth. It's practical." He hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and sense. Another violent shiver from her decided him. "You're right." They arranged themselves carefully on the mattress, back to back, the blankets pulled high. But as the storm raged on and the cold deepened, the awkward distance became impossible to maintain. Eloise couldn't stop shaking despite the covers and the fire. "This isn't working," Red Hawk said quietly. "May I?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He shifted, turning toward her, and carefully drew her back against his chest. His arm settled around her waist, holding her gently but securely. Warmth enveloped her immediately. He radiated heat like a furnace. "Better." His breath stirred her hair. "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper. She could feel every point of contact between them, his chest against her back, his arm across her middle, his legs aligned with hers. It was the closest she'd been to a man since... She pushed that thought away. This was different. Everything about this was different. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but wrapped in Red Hawk's warmth, Eloise found her fear receding. She became aware of other things, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the careful way he held himself to avoid presuming too much, the way his thumb moved in small, soothing circles against the fabric of her wrapper. "Are you still cold?" he asked. No. She was, in fact, growing quite warm. "Red Hawk? What's your given name? Your Christian name? I mean..." He was quiet for a moment. "Daniel." The missionaries insisted on Christian names. Daniel Red Hawk. "Daniel." She tested the name. Found she liked the sound of it. "Why don't you use it?" "Because it's not who I am. Not fully, just as Red Hawk isn't fully who I am either." His arm tightened slightly. "I exist between names, between worlds." She turned in his embrace, needing to see his face. They were very close now, sharing the same pillow, breathing the same air. That must be lonely. It was. His eyes searched hers. "Until you..." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eloise reached up, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. He closed his eyes at the touch, a muscle jumping under her hand. "Eloise." He breathed, a warning and a plea combined. "I know," she whispered. "I know." But she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand drift up to his hair, still damp from the rain. It was softer than she'd expected, like silk between her fingers. His eyes opened, dark and intense in the firelight. "You don't know what you're doing to me," he said roughly. "Then tell me." He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his chest. She could feel his heart racing beneath her palm. "Feel that? That's what you do. Every day. Every moment. When you smile at something you're reading. When you hum while you cook. When you look at me like I'm not something to be feared or pitied, but just a man." Tears pricked her eyes. "You're just a man. A good man. The best I've known. Eloise." She silenced him by pressing closer, her forehead touching his. "I was so frightened when I came here. Not of you. Well, yes, of you. But more of what my life would be. I thought I was trading one cage for another. Instead, you gave me freedom, safety, kindness I didn't know existed." His hand came up to cradle her face, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You gave me more. You gave me hope." The storm seemed to pause, as if the world itself held its breath. Then Eloise closed the last distance between them, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, gentle exploration, but when he groaned softly and pulled her closer, heat flared between them. His mouth moved over hers with growing hunger, and she responded in kind. Years of loneliness and want pouring into the contact. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Red Hawk's eyes were wild, pupils blown wide. "Eloise, we should..." "Should what?" She was trembling, but not from cold. "Tell me you don't want this." "I can't." The words seemed torn from him. "God help me, I can't. I've wanted you since the moment you stood up to those fools in town, defending me when you had no reason to." "Then have me," she whispered against his mouth. "I'm your wife, aren't I?" He made a sound like a man drowning and captured her lips again. This kiss was different, deeper, more demanding. His hands tangled in her hair, angling her head to deepen the contact. She melted against him, her body coming alive in ways she'd never experienced. They loved each other slowly, carefully, with the storm as witness. He touched her like she was made of spun glass, reverent and gentle until she begged for more. When they joined, it was with tears and whispered endearments, two souls finding home in each other at last. Afterward, they lay entwined, sweat cooling on their skin despite the fire's warmth. Red Hawk traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, his expression soft with wonder. "Are you all right?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "More than all right." She burrowed closer, marveling at the solid warmth of him. "I didn't know it could be like that." "Neither did I." At her questioning look, he clarified. "I've known women before, but never like this, never with someone who mattered." She kissed him softly, tasting the truth of his words. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease, thunder grumbling away into the distance. "We have a roof to fix tomorrow," she said against his lips. And water damage to address, winter preparations to finish. So much work." She let her hand wander down his chest, feeling him shiver. "Perhaps we should rest while we can." He caught her hand, laughing low. "Woman, you'll be the death of me." "But what a way to go," she teased, delighting in this new power, this freedom to touch and be touched. He rolled them so she was beneath him, his weight braced on his elbows. "My brave Eloise," he murmured, eyes serious despite their play. "Do you know what you've done? You've made me believe in tomorrow again." Fresh tears threatened. "Oh, Daniel." He smiled at her use of his given name. "Say it again." "Daniel," she repeated, wrapping her arms around his neck. "My Daniel." They made love again as the last of the rain pattered against what remained of the roof, gentle this time, savoring each touch and sigh. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept wrapped around each other. No longer two people maintaining careful distance, but two halves of a newly forged whole. The morning would bring challenges, repairs to make, explanations to give to any who might visit, the ongoing struggle of life on the frontier. But for now, in the dying firelight with the storm's fury spent, Eloise May Sullivan Red Hawk knew perfect contentment in the arms of the man who held her like she was precious, because to him, she was. The days following the storm passed in a blur of repairs and newfound intimacy. They worked side by side fixing the roof, Eloise learning to handle tools while Red Hawk taught her the basics of construction. But now there were stolen kisses between tasks, lingering touches as they passed each other, nights spent exploring the wonder they discovered in each other's arms. For 2 weeks, they existed in their own world, isolated and complete. Then reality intruded in the form of Marcus Walsh, Eloise's second cousin, standing at their door with 3 other men from Cedar Ridge. "Eloise May," Marcus said, his pale eyes sliding dismissively over Red Hawk. "We've come to take you home." She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of her husband. "This is my home. Don't be daft, girl. You can't seriously mean to stay here with this savage." He spat the word like it tasted foul. "Your father sent me. He's had second thoughts about this arrangement. My father has no say in my life anymore." Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "I'm a married woman." One of the other men, a rough-looking character named Josiah Briggs, laughed unpleasantly. "Married? To that? That ain't no Christian marriage. That's an abomination." Red Hawk remained silent behind her, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. His stillness was that of a predator deciding whether to strike. "You need to leave," Eloise said firmly. "All of you, now." Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Listen here, cousin. I didn't ride all this way to leave empty-handed. Your father promised me $50 to bring you back, and I mean to collect. Then you've wasted your time." She lifted her chin. "I'm not going anywhere." His face flushed red. "You'd choose this heathen over your own blood?" "Every time." The slap came without warning, Marcus's hand cracking across her face hard enough to send her stumbling. But before she could fall, Red Hawk was there, catching her with one arm while the other hand closed around Marcus's throat. "Touch her again," Red Hawk said, his voice deadly quiet. "And I'll kill you." The other men reached for their guns, but Red Hawk was faster. Still holding Marcus, he drew his knife with his free hand, pressing it against the man's throat. "Tell them to stand down." Marcus made a choking sound. "Stand down." The men reluctantly lowered their weapons. Red Hawk held the position for another moment, then shoved Marcus away. The man stumbled back, gasping and clutching his throat. "Get off my land," Red Hawk commanded. "Don't come back. This isn't over," Marcus wheezed. "You can't keep a white woman here against her will. We'll be back with the law. I'll tell them the same thing I'm telling you," Eloise said, her cheek throbbing but her voice strong. "I'm here by choice. My choice." The men retreated, but their expressions promised trouble. As their horses disappeared down the trail, Red Hawk turned to examine her face, his fingers ghosting over the rapidly forming bruise. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with self-recrimination. "I should have acted sooner." "You acted exactly when you needed to." She caught his hand. "But they'll be back." Yes, his expression was grim. With more men, probably, maybe the sheriff. They spent the rest of the day in tense preparation. Red Hawk cleaned and loaded all his weapons, while Eloise helped board up the windows, leaving only small gaps for firing through if necessary. As night fell, they sat together by the barricaded door, listening to every sound. "I could leave," Red Hawk said suddenly. "Disappear into the mountains for a while. If I'm not here, they have no reason to—" "Don't you dare!" She gripped his arm. "Don't you dare leave me." "Eloise, if something happens to you because of what I am, something already happened to me because of what you are." She turned his face toward her. "I found love. I found home. I found myself. I won't let them take that." He kissed her fiercely, desperately. "My brave one," he murmured against her lips. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You saw me," she said simply. "Really saw me. That's everything." They made love that night with an urgency born of fear. clinging to each other as if they could hold back the world through force of will alone. When dawn came without incident, they allowed themselves to hope the threat had been exaggerated. That hope died 2 days later when Sheriff Clayton Mills arrived with a dozen armed men. "Mrs. Red Hawk," the sheriff called from a safe distance. "I need you to step out where I can see you. Alone." Eloise emerged slowly, Red Hawk a tense shadow behind her. "Sheriff Mills." "Ma'am." He touched his hat. "I've had some concerning reports. Your cousin says you're being held against your will." "My cousin is a liar who has promised money to drag me back to Kansas." She kept her voice level. "As you can see, I'm perfectly fine. That bruise on your face says otherwise." "Given to me by my cousin, not my husband. Red Hawk defended me." The sheriff studied her for a long moment. He was an older man, weathered by years in the territory, and his eyes held a weary intelligence. "That may be so, ma'am, but I've got a duty to investigate. I need to speak with you privately." "No." Red Hawk stepped forward. "She doesn't go anywhere alone with men who come to our home with guns." "I wasn't asking you. Apache!" one of the deputies snarled. The sheriff held up a hand. "Easy, Patterson. We're here to keep the peace." He looked back at Eloise. "Ma'am, I give you my word no harm will come to you, but I need to hear from your own lips, without him present, that you're here willingly." Eloise felt Red Hawk tense beside her. She touched his arm gently. "It's all right. Sheriff Mills is known as a fair man." She looked at the sheriff. "You can come inside. We'll talk in the kitchen while my husband waits in the main room. The door stays open." It wasn't ideal, but it was a compromise everyone could accept. The sheriff followed her in, his eyes taking in the neat, well-kept home, the evidence of 2 lives being built together. "This is nice," he commented, surprising her. "Better than most places out here. My husband built most of it himself." She couldn't keep the pride from her voice. "Would you like coffee?" "That'd be welcome." "Ma'am." As she prepared the coffee, aware of Red Hawk's tense presence in the next room and the armed men outside, the sheriff spoke quietly. "I've known Marcus Walsh for years. He's a mean drunk and a bully. I'm inclined to believe your version of events, but you need to understand, there's strong feeling in town about mixed marriages. I'm aware. It's going to get worse before it gets better. There's talk of vigilante action if the law doesn't do something." He accepted the coffee gratefully. "I can't be everywhere at once." "What are you saying, Sheriff?" he sighed. "I'm saying you and your husband might want to consider moving on. Further west, maybe California way. Places where folks are more accepting. This is our home." Her voice hardened. "We've done nothing wrong." "No, ma'am, you haven't, but being right doesn't stop a bullet or a torch in the night." He stood, leaving the coffee half drunk. "I'll tell them I found no evidence of coercion, but I can't promise that'll be the end of it." After he left, taking his men with him, Red Hawk pulled her into his arms. "He's right. We should leave." "No." She pushed back to look at him. "I'm tired of running. You've been running your whole life. From the Apache world that was destroyed. From the white world that won't accept you. I ran from Kansas, from shame that wasn't even mine. No more." "Eloise, no more," she repeated firmly. "We stand our ground, together." The attack came 3 nights later. Eloise woke to the smell of smoke and Red Hawk shaking her urgently. "Fire! They've fired the barn." They rushed out to find the structure fully engulfed, flames leaping high into the night sky. The horses were screaming in terror. Without thought, Red Hawk plunged toward the inferno. "Daniel, no!" But he was already disappearing into the smoke. Eloise grabbed buckets, racing to the creek, knowing it was futile but unable to stand idle. She'd made 3 trips when Red Hawk emerged, leading 2 terrified horses, his clothes singed and smoking. "The others?" she gasped. He shook his head, face grim. 3 horses lost, along with their winter feed, tools, and supplies. As they stood watching their livelihood burn, laughter echoed from the darkness. "Hey, Apache!" a voice called. "This is just the beginning. Send that white woman out and we'll leave you be." Red Hawk raised his rifle and fired into the darkness. The laughter stopped, replaced by cursing and the sound of horses galloping away. They spent the night fighting to keep the fire from spreading to the cabin, finally succeeding as dawn broke. Exhausted, covered in soot and burns, they surveyed the damage. The barn was a total loss. Without it, without the horses and supplies, winter would be brutal if not impossible. "Now, will you consider leaving?" Red Hawk asked quietly. Eloise looked at him. Her husband, her love, standing amid the ashes of everything he'd built. His shoulders were bowed with defeat, and it kindled a rage in her she'd never felt before. "Yes," she said, and saw surprise flicker across his face. "We'll leave, but not to run. We're going to town, to the law, to the newspaper, to anyone who'll listen. They want to drive us out with fire and fear, then we'll fight back with truth and justice." "Eloise, the law won't help us. You heard the sheriff. Then we'll make them help. We'll demand it." She gripped his hands. "I'm done being afraid. Done letting them win. They took your barn. We'll rebuild. They threaten us. We'll stand stronger. But we do it legally, publicly, so everyone can see who the real savages are." He stared at her, this fierce woman covered in ash and determination. "You'd do that? Face them all?" "I'd face hell itself for you," she said simply. "For us, for the right to love who I choose and live where I please." He pulled her against him, holding her tight. "My warrior," he whispered into her hair. "My brave, foolish, wonderful warrior. We're going to win this," she said against his chest. "I don't know how, but we will. We have to, because if we don't, if we let them drive us away, then what was it all for?" As the sun rose over the destroyed barn, Eloise began planning their counterattack. She would not go quietly. She would not disappear into the night like they wanted. She would stand in the center of town and declare her choice, her love, her rights as a free woman. And beside her, no longer in the shadows, but in full light, would stand her husband, Daniel Red Hawk, the man who held her like glass not because she was fragile, but because she was precious beyond measure. The war for their right to exist had begun. And Eloise May Sullivan Red Hawk intended to win. In the weeks that followed the barn burning, Eloise threw herself into rebuilding with a determination that surprised even Red Hawk. She rose before dawn to clear debris, her hands blistering as she hauled charred timbers. When Red Hawk tried to take the heavier work from her, she refused. "We do this together," she said firmly. "Everything together." They salvaged what they could from the ruins, metal tools that had survived the heat, nails that could be straightened and reused. The surviving horses were sheltered in a makeshift lean-to against the cabin. It was far from ideal, but it would have to serve. Despite their efforts, Eloise knew they couldn't rebuild alone. They needed supplies, help, and most importantly, they needed the harassment to stop. So on a cold November morning, she dressed in her best remaining dress and announced they were going to town. "Not to slink in for supplies," she clarified when Red Hawk protested. "To be seen, to refuse to hide." The ride to Cedar Ridge was tense. Red Hawk wore his guns openly, his eyes constantly scanning for trouble. But Eloise sat straight-backed beside him, her chin high, projecting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Their first stop was the general store. Mrs. Henderson's face soured when they entered, but Eloise approached the counter with a pleasant smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. We need supplies to rebuild our barn. I have a list." "We don't," the woman began, but Eloise cut her off. "You don't what? Sell to paying customers? Because I have cash money, and last I checked, this was still a business open to the public." Other customers had stopped to watch the exchange. Eloise was counting on that. Witnesses who might not support her, but who would gossip about what they saw. "Fine," Mrs. Henderson bit out. "But you'll pay up front." Of course. Eloise counted out the coins deliberately, making sure everyone could see. "Oh, and we'll need help loading. My husband's back is troubling him after fighting the fire alone all night. The fire that was deliberately set, as I'm sure you've heard." Murmurs rippled through the store. Not everyone was sympathetic to the arsonists. It seemed they made several more stops. The lumber mill, the blacksmith, even the small newspaper office where Eloise placed a notice offering to buy horses. At each location, she was unfailingly polite, deliberately visible, and subtly reminded anyone listening that they were victims of a crime, not perpetrators. The strategy had an unexpected effect. At the lumber mill, the owner's son, a young man named Thomas Garrett, offered to help deliver the wood. "That's kind of you, Thomas," Eloise said warmly. "But I wouldn't want to put you in a difficult position with your neighbors." Thomas flushed. "Not everyone agrees with what was done. Ma'am, burning folks out. That ain't right, no matter who they are." It was a small crack in the wall of hostility, but Eloise seized it. Over the following days, Thomas not only delivered lumber but helped with the rebuilding. He was awkward around Red Hawk at first, but gradually relaxed as they worked side by side. "You're not what I expected," Thomas admitted one afternoon, accepting water from Red Hawk. "What did you expect?" Red Hawk asked mildly. "I don't know. Someone different, meaner, maybe." The young man looked embarrassed. "My PA says I'm a fool for helping, but I figure a man's got to follow his conscience." Word of Thomas's involvement spread, creating ripples of discord in town. Some condemned him as a traitor to his race. Others began to quietly question whether burning out a peaceable family was truly justified. Eloise cultivated these seeds of doubt carefully. When she went to town, always with Red Hawk, always visible, she engaged people in conversation about mundane things, the weather, the crops, the approaching winter. She showed them, day by day, that she was just a woman trying to build a life, not some victim of savage captivity. The next test came when she tried to attend church. They arrived early on a crisp Sunday morning, taking seats in the back pew. The whispers started immediately, rising in volume as more parishioners arrived. Some families turned and left rather than share the sanctuary with them. Reverend Josiah Blackwood, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked troubled as he took the pulpit. He'd been ministering in Cedar Ridge for 20 years, baptizing babies and burying the dead, trying to bring civilization to the frontier. "Before we begin," he said slowly, "I feel I must address the discord in our congregation." Eloise felt Red Hawk tense beside her, ready to leave at the first sign of trouble. She placed a hand on his arm, holding him steady. "The Lord's house," the Reverend continued, "is open to all who seek him. In Galatians, we are told there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, neither male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus." "That doesn't mean we have to accept miscegenation," Marcus Walsh called out from his pew. "It's unnatural." "And what of burning a family's livelihood?" the Reverend asked mildly. "Is that natural, Christian? I seem to recall something about loving thy neighbor." "He ain't our neighbor," someone else shouted. "He's a heathen Apache who sits in the Lord's house seeking worship," the Reverend replied, "as does his lawfully wedded wife. Now, we can continue this discussion, or we can proceed with the service. But I will not have violence or threats in this sanctuary." The service proceeded, though the tension was palpable. Eloise sang the hymns in a clear voice, followed the prayers, and ignored the hostile stares. When it ended, most of the congregation filed out quickly, but a few lingered. An elderly widow named Mrs. Clara Finch approached them hesitantly. "Mrs. Red Hawk," she said, using Eloise's married name deliberately. "I knew your mother. Back in Kansas, Sarah Sullivan was a good Christian woman." Eloise's throat tightened. "Yes, she was. She'd be proud of your courage. Child." "Mrs." Finch glanced at Red Hawk. "Both of yours. My late husband used to trade with the Apache. Said they were honorable folk, more often than not, more honorable than some whites he knew." It was another small crack, another ally in an unexpected place. As they left the church, Reverend Blackwood stopped them. "You're always welcome here," he said quietly. "Both of you. God's love doesn't see color." "Thank you, Reverend," Eloise said. "That means more than you know." The barn raising, when it came, was a mixed affair. Thomas Garrett was there, of course, along with two of his friends who decided to help despite parental disapproval. Mrs. Finch's grandson came, a strapping young man named Peter, even the town drunk. Old Samuel Torres showed up, though that might have been for the free meal Eloise provided. But they were outnumbered by those who came to watch and jeer. Marcus Walsh and his cronies stood at the property line, shouting insults and threats. Sheriff Mills was there too, keeping an uneasy peace. "One spark," Marcus called out, "and it all burns again. You can't watch it forever. Apache." Red Hawk never responded to the taunts, focusing on the work. But Eloise saw the way his jaw tightened, the careful control he maintained. That night, after their helpers had gone and they were alone in their rebuilt barn, she found him sitting in the hayloft, staring out at the stars. "I'm putting you in danger," he said without preamble. "Every day you stay with me increases the risk." She settled beside him, taking his hand. "And every day I stay with you increases my happiness, my purpose, my love. Love won't stop a bullet." "No," she agreed. "But fear won't stop me from living." She turned his face toward her. "Daniel, do you know what my life was before? Empty, shameful, a burden to be passed off to whoever would take me. Now I wake each morning knowing I'm loved, valued, fighting for something worthwhile. You think that's not worth any risk?" He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. "I can't lose you." "Then we'll have to make sure you don't." She pulled back to look at him. "I've been thinking, what if we didn't wait for them to come to us? What if we took the fight to them, legally?" "What do you mean?" "Your land. You own it free and clear, yes, with proper documentation?" "Yes, bought from a Mexican family before the territory changed hands. It's all legal." "Then we file a formal complaint about the barn burning. Demand compensation. Make it a legal matter that can't be ignored." Red Hawk looked skeptical. "The law here won't help an Apache against whites. Maybe not the local law, but there's federal law too. The territorial governor in Prescott, newspapers in Phoenix and Tucson that might be interested in a story about vigilante violence." She gripped his hands. "We make it bigger than Cedar Ridge, too big to ignore or cover up. That's a dangerous strategy. It could bring more violence, or it could bring justice, real change." She smiled grimly. "What do we have to lose that they haven't already tried to take?" The next morning, Eloise sat at their table and began writing letters. To the territorial governor, detailing the harassment and arson. To newspapers, telling their story of a legal marriage being persecuted by lawless vigilantes. To anyone who might listen and have power to act. Red Hawk watched her work. This woman who'd arrived as a frightened mail-order bride and transformed into a warrior for justice. "You humble me," he said quietly. She looked up from her writing. "How so?" "I spent years accepting their hatred as unchangeable, building walls instead of bridges. You've been here mere months and you're already changing minds, finding allies I never thought possible." "Because I see what you couldn't," she said. "I see their fear. They're terrified of you, of what you represent, a native man who's educated, successful, married to a white woman by choice. You shatter their comfortable lies about superiority. And you think making them more afraid will help?" "No. I think making them accountable will help. Fear thrives in darkness. We're going to drag this into the light." As she sealed the first letter, a strange sensation washed over her. Dizziness accompanied by nausea. She gripped the table, waiting for it to pass. "Eloise?" Red Hawk was beside her instantly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, just tired. We've been working hard." But as the days passed, the dizzy spells continued, accompanied by other symptoms she tried to hide. Tender breasts, exhaustion that sleep didn't cure, and most tellingly, the absence of her monthly courses. The possibility both thrilled and terrified her. A child, here, now, with violence hanging over them like a sword. But also, a child. The one thing she'd thought her body could never give her after the accident in her youth. She said nothing to Red Hawk. Not yet. Not until she was sure. But she found herself placing a protective hand over her belly as she worked, as she faced down hostile townspeople, as she fought for their right to exist in peace. If she was right, if she carried their child, then the stakes had risen immeasurably. This wasn't just about their right to love anymore. It was about their child's right to exist in a world that would see them as an abomination, neither fully white nor fully Apache, caught between worlds just as their father was. The thought strengthened her resolve. She would not let hatred win. She would not let their child grow up in shadows and shame. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, she would carve out a place for them in this harsh land. As she watched Red Hawk work in the corral with their remaining horses, his movements graceful and sure, she allowed herself to imagine it, their child with his dark eyes and her stubborn spirit, growing up free under the vast Arizona sky. First, though, they had to survive what was coming. The letters had been sent. The challenge had been issued. Now they waited to see who would answer, allies or enemies, justice or more violence. Either way, Eloise May Sullivan Red Hawk was ready to fight. The response to Eloise's letters came faster than expected. Within 2 weeks, a representative from the territorial government arrived in Cedar Ridge. A stern-faced lawyer named Harrison Caldwell, who took rooms at the hotel and began making inquiries. "This is your doing," Marcus Walsh snarled at Eloise when she next went to town. "Bringing outsiders into local matters." "Arson isn't a local matter," she replied calmly. "It's a crime." The investigation stirred the town like a stick in a hornet's nest. Caldwell interviewed witnesses, examined the burned remains of the barn, and documented everything meticulously. Some townspeople refused to cooperate. Others, emboldened by official attention, began to speak up about what they'd seen and heard. It was Mrs. Finch who provided the most damning testimony. She'd seen men gathering at Walsh's saloon the night of the fire, heard them drunkenly boasting afterward about smoking out the Apache. "I've held my tongue too long," she told Caldwell firmly. "But when men start burning out families, decent folk need to speak up." The pressure of the investigation took its toll. Eloise noticed she was being followed when she went to town, hostile eyes tracking her every move. One afternoon, as she left the general store, she found her wagon's wheels had been damaged, spokes broken with deliberate force. Thomas Garrett found her examining the damage. "Let me help," he said, already moving to assess the wheels. "This is getting worse. Mrs. Red Hawk, they're getting desperate." "Good," Eloise said grimly. "Desperate people make mistakes." She was walking back to the hotel where Caldwell was staying, intending to report the vandalism, when it happened. Rough hands grabbed her from behind, dragging her into an alley. A flour sack was pulled over her head, muffling her screams. "Should have left when you had the chance," a voice growled. "Not Marcus. Someone else. Young. Nervous." She was thrown onto what felt like a wagon bed, hands quickly tied. The wagon lurched into motion, and panic clawed at her throat. But beneath the fear, rage burned bright. They wouldn't break her. They wouldn't win. The ride seemed endless, though it was probably less than an hour. When the wagon stopped and she was hauled out, she could smell water, the creek that ran behind the old mission ruins. She guessed. The sack was yanked off her head, revealing 3 men with bandanas covering their faces. "Here's what's going to happen," one said. "You're going to write a letter to that government man. Tell him you were mistaken about the fire. Tell him you want to drop all complaints. Then you're going to leave. Tonight." "No." The backhand caught her across the same cheek Marcus had struck weeks ago. She tasted blood, but kept her feet. "You don't seem to understand," the man continued. "This isn't a negotiation. Neither is this," a cold voice said from behind them. The men spun to find Red Hawk standing at the edge of the clearing, rifle leveled. Behind him stood Sheriff Mills and 2 deputies, all armed. "Gentlemen," the sheriff said mildly, "I believe kidnapping is a federal offense. Mr. Caldwell will be very interested to add this to his report." The men looked at each other, calculating odds. Then one made a break for it. Red Hawk's rifle butt caught him in the stomach. dropping him retching to the ground. The other two surrendered without further resistance. As the deputies unmasked and arrested the men, including Marcus Walsh's nephew and two ranch hands from the Circle Bar, Red Hawk cut Eloise's bonds and pulled her into his arms. "How did you find me?" "Thomas saw them take you. He ran for the sheriff while I tracked the wagon." His hands shook as they framed her face. "Are you hurt?" "No, angry, but not hurt." She turned to Sheriff Mills. "Thank you." The sheriff looked tired. "I've been trying to keep the peace, but this has gone too far. Mr. Caldwell's investigation has made it clear I need to choose a side." He met her eyes. "I choose law and order." "Ma'am, always have, even when it's uncomfortable." The arrests were the tipping point, with 3 men facing federal charges and Caldwell's investigation revealing a pattern of systematic harassment. The tide began to turn, not toward acceptance, that would take generations, but toward a grudging acknowledgement that violence wouldn't be tolerated. Marcus Walsh was arrested 2 days later, caught trying to leave town with a suspicious amount of money. Under questioning, one of his accomplices revealed Walsh had been paid by a group of ranchers to drive Red Hawk off his land. They wanted his water rights. It was never just about race. Caldwell told them, "It usually isn't. Hatred makes a convenient cover for greed." The revelation fractured the opposition. Some, like the ranchers, slunk back into silence. Others, the true believers in racial superiority, grew more virulent but less organized, and a surprising number of townspeople, freed from the mob mentality, began to treat the Red Hawks with cautious neutrality. It was in this atmosphere of uneasy peace that Eloise finally visited Dr. Benjamin Carter. She'd waited as long as she dared, but the signs were unmistakable now. Dr. Carter, a young man fresh from medical school back east, examined her with professional thoroughness. "Mrs. Red Hawk," he said finally, "you're approximately 3 months pregnant." The words she'd both hoped and feared to hear. Is everything well? I had an accident years ago. Everything appears normal? You're young and healthy? I see no reason for concern, though given your history, we'll want to monitor things closely." She left his office in a daze, one hand pressed protective over her still flat belly. The timing was terrible, or perhaps perfect. A child would cement their claim to the land, their right to build a future, but it would also make them more vulnerable, give their enemies another target. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she took Red Hawk's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I have something to tell you." His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Eloise, are you—" "Yes." She watched emotions chase across his face. Joy, fear, wonder, worry. "Doctor, Carter says about 3 months." He slid from his chair to kneel before her, both hands now cradling her belly as if holding something infinitely precious. "A child," he whispered. "Our child. Are you happy?" He looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "Happy? He struggled for words. "I never thought—" "My line was supposed to end with me. No Apache woman would have me. No white woman should. And now you're going to be a father." She ran her fingers through his hair. "Our child will be born free. Daniel, not fully Apache, not fully white, but fully loved, fully human." He pressed his forehead against her stomach. "What if the world won't accept? Then we'll change the world, one mind at a time, one heart at a time." She lifted his face. "We've already started, haven't we? Thomas, Mrs., Finch, Dr. Carter, even Sheriff Mills. Change is possible." He kissed her then, pouring all his hope and fear and love into the contact. When they parted, his expression had shifted to determination. "We need to prepare. The house needs to be safer. We need supplies, plans. We need to live," she corrected gently. "Yes, we prepare, but we also live. We plant that garden I've been planning. We raise horses. We invite Thomas for dinner. We go to church. We show them that we're not going anywhere." The following Sunday, when Reverend Blackwood asked if anyone had announcements, Eloise stood. The congregation turned to stare, some hostile, some curious. "My husband and I want to share our joy," she said, voice clear and steady. "We're expecting a child in the spring." The silence was deafening. Then Mrs. Finch began to clap. Thomas joined her, then Dr. Carter, then a handful of others. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Enough to show that their child wouldn't be born into complete isolation. Reverend Blackwood smiled. "Children are a blessing from the Lord. We'll add you to our prayers, Mrs. Red Hawk." As they left church, several women approached Eloise. Not to congratulate, that would be too much, but to offer advice about morning sickness, to recommend remedies, to share the universal experience of motherhood that transcended racial lines. "It's not acceptance," one woman murmured, glancing around nervously. "But a baby." Well, babies change things. That night, as Eloise lay in Red Hawk's arms, she felt their child move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings. She gasped, grabbing his hand and pressing it to the spot. "Did you feel that?" His eyes widened. "Was that our baby, our fighter?" She smiled through tears, just like its parents. They lay in comfortable silence, hands intertwined over her belly. Outside, November wind rattled the windows, but inside they were warm, safe, together. "I've been thinking about names," Red Hawk said eventually. "If it's a boy, Samuel, after your father. And if it's a girl, Sarah, after your mother, or—" He hesitated. "My mother's name was Maria Elena. She died when I was young, but she was the strongest woman I ever knew. Until you." "Maria Sarah," Eloise said softly, bridging both worlds. Like her parents. The investigation concluded with multiple indictments. Marcus Walsh and his conspirators would stand trial in Prescott. The ranchers who'd funded the harassment faced civil suits. Caldwell, before leaving, pulled the Red Hawks aside. "You've won this battle," he said. "But the war for acceptance will be longer. Are you prepared for that?" "We're prepared to live our lives," Eloise replied. "To raise our child. To be good neighbors to those who'll let us. That's all anyone can do." Caldwell smiled. "You know, Mrs. Red Hawk, you should consider law. You'd make a formidable attorney." As winter settled over the valley, bringing cold winds and occasional snow, the Red Hawk household prepared for the future. The new barn was reinforced, the house fortified, supplies laid in. But there were also softer preparations, tiny clothes sewn by lamplight, a cradle carved by Red Hawk's patient hands, lullabies hummed while cooking. The hatred hadn't disappeared. It had merely been driven underground, held in check by law and the shifting opinion of moderate townspeople. There would be other challenges, other battles. But for now, in their warm cabin with new life growing between them, Eloise and Daniel Red Hawk had won something precious. The right to hope, to plan, to dream of a future where their child could walk freely under the vast Arizona sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Red Hawk asked one snowy evening. "Coming here, choosing this hard life?" Eloise looked up from the baby blanket she was knitting. "Do you remember what I thought when I first came? I thought you'd be cruel. I thought I was trading one misery for another. And instead, I found love. I found strength I didn't know I had. I found home." She set aside her knitting and moved to sit in his lap. "I found you, and now, our child. How could I regret the path that led to such treasures?" He held her close, one hand splayed protectively over her growing belly. "My brave one, my heart." Outside, snow fell silently, blanketing the desert in temporary peace. Inside, two people who'd found each other against all odds held tight to their love, their hope, and the promise of new life that would bloom in spring, proof that love could indeed conquer all, one careful victory at a time. Spring arrived with the explosion of wildflowers across the desert, painting the harsh landscape in brilliant purples, yellows, and reds. Eloise, now heavy with child, stood on the porch watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Her hand rested on her swollen belly where their baby kicked and tumbled, eager to join the world. "You shouldn't be on your feet so much," Red Hawk said, appearing behind her with a cup of the herbal tea doctor. Carter had recommended, "I'm pregnant, not invalid," she replied, but accepted the tea gratefully. Besides, how can I resist such beauty? He wrapped his arms around her from behind, hands joining hers over their child. "You're the beautiful one," he murmured against her hair. These past months had brought changes beyond just her growing belly. The town's hostility had cooled to wary tolerance, especially after Marcus Walsh was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Some, like Thomas Garrett, who now came for dinner weekly, had become true friends. Others maintained their distance but no longer actively threatened. "Thomas is bringing his sister today," Eloise reminded him. "She's curious about the herbs you use for healing." Redhawk nuzzled her neck. "Another crack in their wall of ignorance. One stone at a time, my love, one stone at a time." The baby kicked particularly hard, making them both laugh. "This one's going to be a fighter," Redhawk said. "With parents like us, how could they be anything else?" The pain started that evening, just as Thomas and his sister Mary were preparing to leave. Eloise tried to hide them at first, not wanting to alarm anyone, but when her water broke during dinner, there was no concealing it. "The baby!" Mary exclaimed. "Thomas, ride for Doctor. Carter, quickly!" What followed was a blur of pain and effort. Doctor. Carter arrived within the hour, bringing his nurse, Mrs. Patricia Stone, a widow who'd shocked the town by working outside the home. She took charge immediately, banishing the men to the front room. "First babies take their time," she informed Eloise briskly. "We're in for a long night." She was right. All through the night and into the next day, Eloise labored. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Waves that threatened to pull her under. But each time she faltered, she heard Redhawk's voice through the door, singing in Apache, old songs his mother had taught him, melodies of strength and courage. "He hasn't left that spot," Mrs. Stone said during a brief respite. "Just sits against the door singing. Never seen anything like it. He's calling our child home." Eloise gasped as another contraction hit, giving them strength for the journey. "Doctor." Carter checked her progress again. "Soon now. When the next pain comes, push." The final stage was brutal but mercifully quick. With a last enormous effort, Eloise brought their child into the world, a daughter who announced her arrival with a cry that could have woken the mountains. "A girl," Mrs. Stone exclaimed. "A beautiful, healthy girl." The baby was placed on Eloise's chest, still wailing her displeasure at the bright, cold world. She had a shock of dark hair, unfocused eyes that might be any color, and tiny fists that waved in indignation. "Let the father in," Eloise whispered, unable to look away from the miracle in her arms. Redhawk entered tentatively, as if afraid to disturb the scene. When he saw his daughter, his face crumpled. He crossed to the bed in 2 strides, falling to his knees beside them. "Our daughter," Eloise said, shifting so he could see better. "Maria Sarah Redhawk." With trembling hands, he touched the baby's cheek. She immediately turned toward his finger, seeking, and he made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Look what we made. Eloise, look what our love created." "Would you like to hold her?" Mrs. Stone asked gently. Redhawk looked terrified at the prospect, but nodded. With careful instruction, he took his daughter into his arms. The baby, who'd been fussing, immediately calmed, staring up at her father with dark, serious eyes. "She knows you," Eloise murmured. "All those nights you sang to her." "Hello, little warrior," he whispered to the baby. "I'm your father. I promise to protect you, to teach you, to love you with everything I have." Dr. Carter and Mrs. Stone quietly withdrew, giving the new family privacy. Thomas, who'd waited all night, poked his head in briefly to offer congratulations before leaving as well. As the sun set on Maria's first day of life, the little family huddled together on the bed. The baby nursed contentedly while her parents marveled at her tiny features. "She'll face challenges," Redhawk said quietly. "Being mixed blood in this world." "She'll face them with strength," Eloise replied, "with parents who love her. A community that's slowly learning acceptance and the fierce spirit I already see in her. What if— No. Eloise placed a finger over his lips. No what-ifs. Not today. Today we celebrate. Today we have everything. Word of the birth spread quickly. Over the following days, unexpected visitors arrived. Mrs. Finch brought a quilt she'd made in secret. Thomas and Mary came with preserves and offers to help with chores. Even some who'd been hostile before stopped by with small gifts. Not quite acceptance, but acknowledgement that a baby changed things. Reverend Blackwood came to offer blessings. As he held Maria, he smiled. Children are bridges, he said. They connect what seems impossible to join. But it was the unexpected visit a week after the birth that moved them most. An elderly Apache woman appeared at their door, accompanied by a younger man who translated. She is my grandmother's cousin, the man explained. She heard of a child born to one of our people and a white woman. She comes to give blessings. The old woman approached slowly, her weathered hands gentle as she touched Maria's head. She spoke in Apache, her voice rising and falling like music. She says the child is blessed, the translator relayed. Born between worlds, she will walk in both. She will be a bridge, a healer of old wounds. She sees strength in her and wisdom to come. The woman pressed a small leather pouch into Eloise's hands, a protection charm for the baby. Then, as quietly as she'd come, she left. Your people, Eloise said to Red Hawk, who stood transfixed. They haven't forgotten you. I thought they had. I thought I was dead to them. Perhaps our daughter will change that too. As Maria grew over the following weeks, the changes in the community continued. The baby had a way of breaking down barriers. When Eloise brought her to town, women who'd previously shunned her would peek at the child, eventually coming closer to coo over her dark eyes and rosebud mouth. She looks like any baby, one woman said, surprise evident in her voice. What did you expect? Eloise asked mildly. Horns? The woman flushed but didn't retreat. She's beautiful. Thank you. All children are beautiful, don't you think? All deserving of a chance to grow up safe and loved? Seeds planted, one conversation at a time. The real test came when Eloise decided to have Maria baptized. Some in the congregation protested. But Reverend Blackwood stood firm. This child is innocent of any perceived sins of her parents, he declared. And I find no sin in love sanctified by marriage and blessed with new life. Any who cannot worship in peace with this family should examine their own hearts. A few families left, but most stayed, as Reverend Blackwood sprinkled water on Maria's head. She cooed and reached for the light streaming through the church windows. Even hardened hearts softened at the sight. After the service, something remarkable happened. Young mothers approached Eloise, drawn by the universal experience of motherhood. They exchanged advice about teething, compared notes on sleeping patterns, shared remedies for common ailments. Maria became not the half-breed child, but simply another baby in the community. Change happened slowly. Doctor, Carter observed during one of Maria's checkups. But it happens. Your daughter is proof that the world can be different than it was. Summer brought new challenges. A drought threatened crops and livestock, making water even more precious. Some ranchers eyed Red Hawk's water rights with renewed interest, but now he wasn't alone in defending them. Thomas Garrett and several others made it clear that any move against the Red Hawks would be met with resistance. You're our neighbors now, Thomas said simply. We protect our own. One blazing August day, as Eloise sat in the shade nursing Maria, she saw riders approaching. Her hand moved instinctively toward the rifle, always kept close, but Red Hawk, working in the garden, held up a calming hand. The riders were Apache, 3 men, travel-worn and wary. They spoke with Red Hawk in their language, gestures indicating they were asking for water. Without hesitation, he led them to the well. Who are they? Eloise asked when he returned. Scouts for the army. Apache scouts tracking raiders. White men who've been hitting Mexican settlements and blaming it on Apaches. His expression was complex. They heard about us, about Maria. They wanted to see for themselves. One of the scouts approached, removing his hat respectfully. In broken English, he said, "Your woman, your child, brave, good." He produced a small carved wooden bird, offering it shyly for Maria, for strength, for flying between worlds. After they left, Red Hawk stood holding his daughter, the wooden bird clutched in her tiny fist. "She's already building bridges," he said wonderingly. "Already healing wounds I thought would bleed forever." That night, as they lay in bed with Maria sleeping between them, Eloise reflected on their journey, from the terrified mail-order bride expecting cruelty to this, a mother, a wife, a woman who'd helped change a community's heart. The road hadn't been easy, and challenges remained, but looking at her husband's peaceful face, feeling her daughter's warm weight against her side, she knew every struggle had been worth it. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "And I love you," he replied, revealing he was awake. "Both of you. My whole world." "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me we'll tell Maria her story. All of it, the fear, the hatred, but also the courage, the love, the people who chose to see past difference. I promise she'll know she was born from love that conquered fear, that her very existence is proof that change is possible." "Hope," Eloise murmured, remembering their original thought for a name. "That's what she really is, our hope for a better world." As if in agreement, Maria sighed in her sleep, one tiny hand reaching out to touch each parent. In that gesture, Eloise saw the future, a child who would indeed walk between worlds, bridging them with love, courage, and the unshakable knowledge that she belonged. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first night together, their struggles, their triumphs. And in a small cabin in the Arizona desert, 3 hearts beat as one, proof that love could indeed conquer all, that families could bloom in the most unlikely soil, and that hope, once planted, could grow strong enough to change the world. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the Wild West. Where are you enjoying this tale of love conquering prejudice? Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Eloise and Red Hawk's journey. Your feedback means everything to us.